In this next installment of Supernatural Tales of the Marine Corps, it's going to take place in September of 1986 in the Philippines on one of the many thousands of uninhabited islands. And we are investigating the sightings and encounters of an ancient winged creature. And 1986 was a year that typhoons actually were just ripping apart the Pacific. There was 13 typhoons, 3 super typhoons, countless named storms, and it just tore things apart and woke things up that shouldn't have been awoken. So I'm going to remove my ugly face from the video and just let you listen to my voice while you see overlaid images. I thought that might be more soothing for you, and I hope you enjoy it. And keep following this channel, liking and subscribing for more supernatural tales. Take care. The Philippines has over 7,000 islands. Did you know that? Of that number, only like 2,000 or so are inhabited, leaving over 5,000 uninhabited. They vary in size, but some are large, some are small. But don't worry, I didn't know either until I found out on our first official mission for SARU. Okay, perched in the bow of a PBMK-3 patrol boat as we entered the mouth of a river, surrounded by jungle that had this weird primeval look that made you think it had just jumped out of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's Lost World. Okay. I had done jungle survival training in the Philippines, but this jungle staring at us, looked as old as time itself. I shivered, a chill working its way down my spine, as we rounded this bend in the river, causing the ocean to disappear from our sight. How did we get here in the first place? Well, the last few weeks have been a whirlwind of activity as the Corps tried to build out our new unit. I'll be honest, it went as expected, meaning it was a total goat screw. A few days after we had arrived back in Hawaii from Okinawa, we had collected our personal belongings out of battalion storage and moved into our new digs. They put us in 3-man rooms in officer country on the air wing side of Kaneohe. It was kind of strange, but we figured they wanted us isolated from our fellow enlisted Marines for now, at least until everything was set up to, someone's satisfaction that was way above our pay grade. Pete and Joe ended up with me for the moment, with Ring and Morgan were together. We assumed we'd have others, join us in a short time, and we were right. The first to join us was a PFC named Higgs from the Combat Engineers, and he bunked up with Ring and Morgan. A corpsman named Weinberg, who'd been on submarine duty of all things, joined us the day after Higgs, along with a Lance Corporal who came from 3-3. That dude was a specimen, one of those lucky bastards who was chiseled without really lifting a weight. He looked scary as hell until he smiled, and that smile kind of lit up a room, and he was a very easygoing guy. I'll tell you more about him later, but he'd been raised by his grandma in Harlem, of all places. And he actually had a branding scar where he'd covered over some gang tattoos. It was hard to get in the Corps with tattoos and stuff back in the day, much less gang stuff. I wish I could tell you his last name. I remember his first name was Dennis, but I swear to God, everyone else just called him Buddha for 3 years because he was so into Eastern culture. We got an officer right after that, a second lieutenant of all things. He wasn't even an academy guy. He'd gone to regular college and then OCS, and he had an R after his USMC, meaning he was a trial officer, and he hoped he would get a full commission before his time was up. His name was Penke, but we referred to him as Pinky or Rhode Island Red because he had red hair, was kind of short, and was from Rhode Island. Sometimes the obvious nicknames are best, of course. And honestly, I couldn't stand that guy at first, but I came to love the little bantam rooster over time. He taught me a lot, And can you believe the man joined the French Foreign Legion a few years later? The French Foreign Legion. Who does that? And anyway, by the middle of the month, we had 13 guys, including the lieutenant, which was not nearly enough, but here we were. It was around September 25th, coasting up a spooky river on some forsaken island of the PI in the West Pacific. No one was happy about the mission. It was rushed, and we were short guys. In my opinion, which absolutely counted for nothing. We shouldn't even be here like this. I don't think most of the new guys even believed what we had seen in Okinawa when dead guys were coming back to life. I don't think even the lieutenant, Pinky, fully believed us. He kept grilling us for the last 3 weeks every so often, asking the same questions, repeatedly. So a jolt to the patrol boat, brought me back to the present, and I felt the PB easing up and powering down. The commander in charge yelled it was as far as we could, that they could take the the patrol boat, and it was time for us to disembark. So there were just too many obstacles in the water now for even a low-drafted boat like the PB MK3. So the boat crew helped us deploy 2 Zodiacs, those rubber raider boats you've probably all seen in like movies and TV, etc. and we dropped all our gear in, got it secured, and we split up between the boats. The commander said, they're going to pull back to the mouth of the river to await our call for pickup. He reminded us that he was to wait for 3 days, etc., to call in. If we didn't, he'd return to the spot, wait for 6 hours before we'd be left behind. What rescue options there were after that, that was undetermined. So there was a lot of dark muttering about that, but the LT told everyone to just stow it. He's right. We'd been briefed on that little grim option well before we got here. We volunteered. We didn't have to even come. So it is what it is. We moved cautiously, in single file of the boats, using the quiet outboard motors to slowly navigate further along the waterway. And, most of us had trained in these, and the LT was manning the motor on the lead boat, and Higgs, of all people, was guiding the second one. So this was the mission, basically. You see, in 86, there were so many typhoons in the Pacific, it seemed like the end of the world. When Typhoon Vera was hitting Okinawa, Typhoon Wayne was battering the Philippines. 6 weeks before Wayne, Super Typhoon Peggy had hit the Philippines. I guess all that churning was just like waking things up all over the Pacific. Anyway, a Filipino fishing boat got blown off course, ended up getting slammed against the island we now found ourselves on. And they had used the river to shelter from the storm. And someone from the boat had seen a tower where, no tower should be. So as the typhoon ended, a few of the more adventurous ones decided to try and trek to the tower. They never really reached it, but they also supposedly saw, an ancient-looking ruined city. Get this, the reason they didn't make it, they say a winged monster drove them off and killed 2 of them. The rest fled and managed to navigate their boat out of the river and back home, and they immediately reported what they had seen to the authorities. Now, even though the Philippines was in turmoil in all of '86 with all the coups happening, coup attempts, etc., someone must have believed them enough to notify the U.S. Hence the reason we were there. Our orders were really simple, basically. Find the city, see if there was a winged monster the size of a man, and go deal with it. So, were there Batman jokes? Yeah, enough of them that they became unfunny and then, came round again and were funny again. So, but, really, 2 events involving fishermen. I was really starting to hate fishermen in general, but there it was. Anyway, there's only 13 of us on this mission, and, can you tempt fate any better? Marines are superstitious as hell. I would always think I wasn't, myself superstitious until I realized, I always prepared the same way, like it was a ritual, and I carried a lucky silver dollar that my grandmother had given me, that my, supposedly got my dad through Vietnam alive. Like I said, we were short bodies. We really should have had more people. This was not a 2-man or a 4-man stay job. That's, surveillance and target acquisition, if you're not familiar with that. This wasn't scouting or sniping even. We were set up like this, though. So we had 2 4-man fire teams with me leading one, Morgan's leader of the other. Each team had someone on a SAW M249 light machine gun. Those fired the standard 5.56 rounds. It was boot on my team and ring on in the other team on the duty of the SAW. So each team had a M203 grenade launcher attached to a 16. I was carrying one of those, and Pete was carrying for the other team. I think they ended up switching down the way, but at the moment he had it. 2 other members were just carrying, the regular 16s, but Morgan had his 40 cal sniper rifle with him as well. And I was also carrying my 45 sidearm because my idea of close combat was a 45 in someone's face. Screw all that other stuff. The other 5 members of the team were sort of like the HQ team. We had, Lieutenant Penke, Doc Weinberg, Higgs, the engineer, a battalion-level radio guy, and some guy from Force Recon that had joined at the last minute. There were supposed to have been 2 of those guys from Force Recon so they could operate as a pair, but it hadn't happened yet. So he was just hanging with HQ for now. Hell, there wasn't even anyone above Corporal with us except the LT. And I would really have preferred 2 more fire teams, and sometime in the future, we'd have them, but not this time. So, being short-sticked was nothing new for Marines, basically. So up the river we went. We were making haste slowly, as Augustus had once said when something occurred to me. So I slipped back to the rear of the boat to talk to the LT. I asked him if he thought it was weird the PT boat couldn't go any farther up than a fishing vessel, because, he acknowledged my thought, but added it wasn't as weird as the area we were going to that was essentially a satellite black hole. We had intel on the island, and a lot of pictures were there for our briefing back in Hawaii, but there were sections where it was just dark. Intel couldn't explain it, but I could, It's bad karma, bad karma. That would actually become SARU's radio call sign after this mission. So, we weren't on really any sort of silent order, and some of the guys were low talking as they kept an eye on the river and the jungle. And, I don't know if you know this, but the Philippine Islands are just full of venomous and non venomous snakes of all sorts. But if you're going to start a snake cult, this was the place to do it. Hell, there's 4 to 5 different cobras, along with like other pit vipers, and they even have a flying snake, a freaking flying snake. It's called the paradise flying tree snake or something. And did I mention they have crocodiles too? Yeah, well, they do. In fact, I heard Buddha sing out, holy shit, look at that thing. And he's pointing off to the port side at a croc that was just lounging on an embankment. Now, our Zodiac boats were 20 footers, and this thing was bigger. I kid you not. It was bigger than the Zodiac. That means more than 20 feet. So everyone became way more alert as the size of that croc sank in. Double check your mags is basically what I told our boat, just in case. So it was really probably only about 5 more minutes of gliding up the murky river when we saw the tower. It was like a blackened fang jutting from among the trees on top of this small escarpment, and we could see what looked like a rough animal trail that seemed to lead up to it from the water. Looked a little bit broken, but looks like we could get up it. So then now we also understood how the fishing boat had made it this far and how they found the tower. We figured that the consecutive typhoons had flooded the river so bad and uprooted a bunch of the ancient trees and the other flora, leaving the tower and presumably the so-called city visible instead of buried in the jungle. And when the water level was higher, the fishing boat could come up farther. So there we were. Would we see a winged monster was the real question. So the lieutenant gave orders as the 2 Zodiacs headed towards a likely landing spot. And I had Buddha covering the front from the bow and the rest of the guys covering and scanning the shore. Boat 2, Morgan's group, looked like they were scanning the trees and the small cliffs around us like they should be doing. I really didn't care for the boxed-in feeling that I had here. The river was really feeling like we were walking down a city block that was surrounded by small buildings, if you know what I mean. And a lot of our vision was obscured. But as our boat touched the shore, Buddha and I were off in an instant. Followed by Joe and our other dude, Kane, who was a PFC, come over from 7th Marines. That I constantly forget his name all the time. And I don't know why. I go back and forth, but my memory's just not as good. So I remember cursing, silently as water squished in my boots, my jungle boots. My wet feet already, surely a jinx. Definitely a jinx. So Morgan's team fanned left, and we were sort of connected in a defensive arc. The lieutenant and the others were already securing the Zodiacs, piling our gear into the overgrown shore where it was dry enough, where everything wasn't getting soaked. And the plan, which in my mind was full of a lot of ifs and maybes, along with a dose of hope, was to bivouac overnight on the escarpment while we got our bearings and probe into the city ruins at first light. We'd had a briefing back in Hawaii and another when we hit Subic Bay, the naval base at Olongapo City. Crazily, we missed our friends in 1-3 by a week. They were already back in Okinawa. Now, the briefing was incomplete at best. We don't know this, and so this is just going to be a snoop and poop op, meaning stealthy entry, reconnaissance, gather information type deal. Poop meaning info, aka what's the poop. Later there'd be some poop in a pants opportunity, but not yet, of course. So the best intel we had was that the tower escarpment was the way up was going to be navigable, and we'd be able to see the ruins from the escarpment. The fishermen had not gone to the tower, and they did not go to the city, but they did see it from the escarpment. So they didn't really have a way to reach it from the escarpment. We were assuming we'd find something. I mean, you don't build a watchtower for nothing. So how we got there was just going to be up to us because, like I said, it was a satellite black hole. We had no terrain images, but it should be like the rest of the island, we were told. As for the winged monster, well, the description was this: 6 to 8 feet tall, simian-like face or very human face, naked or covered in fur or some ragged clothing, and not fur but leathery skin. And the wings, yeah, leather-like, fur-covered, with a span of 8 to 12 feet. A great description from a bunch of panicked, terror-ridden fishermen. It was all over the map. Personally, I was hoping it was just one of those giant bats that are native to the PI. They could get over 2 feet tall. In fact, those things, the proper name for them, I think, is the golden-capped fruit bat. Has a wingspan of 5 to 6 feet. It's only native to the PI, and while a native Filipino should not mistake one for an 8-foot monster, We were actually hoping that was exactly what had happened. In fact, back in '85, we'd been training in the Philippines. This was when I was with Alpha Company, 1st Battalion, 3rd Marine still, and we'd been humping some hellish valley. And by coincidence, Ring, was in front of me at the time, and as the company, we were walking along this shallow river bed, and we'd been at it for hours. It was hot, and the what are these monkey things called? The macaques were making just unholy noise in the trees that flanked both sides of the river, and it's like I said, it's hot. Everyone's annoyed, and Ring, he picked up a river rock and flung it at the trees with like a curse at the monkeys, basically. Next thing you know, there's this noise of something falling, hitting the branches on the way down. And a few of us ran over, not believing that Ring had actually hit a monkey. He hadn't. He'd actually hit a fruit bat that had just been minding its own business, sleeping upside down in the trees. And the rock had hit it square in its little forehead. It was already in the bat afterlife before it hit the ground. And the thing was huge. It looked like a little old man with a beard and wings, of course. But you see why we're hoping this mission was just an overactive imagination gone wild. Turning a giant bat view into a monster. And then again, what if a bat could get like 8 feet tall? Would it still eat fruit or something else? So anyway, back to the present mission. The LT gave us some stick, got us sorted out and focused. He decided we'd take all our gear and supplies up in one swoop. We'd cover the boats and not leave a guard. We're not dealing with humans here, so we're hoping that just nothing will pay attention to the boats. We'd be able to see them from the top if we needed to, or with the night vision goggles, etc. We'd be able to cover them or see what's happening. Like I said, the theory being no animal would steal them, and most likely no monster is going to pay attention to them. Plus, it was bait in a sense. So anyway, Morgan's team took the lead, and he walked point with Ring walking slack behind him. My team drew the short stick, and all 4 of us had to hump 5-gallon water cans up along with our own gear, etc. So, everyone was carrying a little something extra on this little jaunt up the trail, except Morgan and Ring. And the Force Recon guy, he was tailing Charlie, covering the rear. So we made it up to the escarpment without really too much trouble. The path was a little tangled from storms, or else it would have been easier. And it was definitely a water trail for animals. What kind of animals, I couldn't even begin to guess. But here's the thing. We all seemed to realize at the same time, as we were almost to the top, the lack of noise from the jungle around us. I heard Higgs say, where's the noise? It's way too quiet. So my brain had been reaching the same conclusion, and all of a sudden the LT told us to hold up as he drifted by me. I heard him say, I don't like this quiet. I don't think he even heard Higgs. He's just like the same idea hit everyone at once. The spooky part was, and I don't really know how to explain this, we could hear the usual noise from the jungle. The sounds you should hear, just out of touch, you could say. It was like we were in a dead zone, and then farther back from us was normal sounds. So, again, bad karma. Anyway, Morgan and Ring, they went on ahead to check the top out while we waited. The Force Recon guy's name, well, I just remembered. His name is Bustamante. Duh. I'm sorry, my memory is hit and miss a lot nowadays, like I said. Anyway, Bustamante eased back down the trail, was just, covering the rear. The LT sent Pete and the other team, 2 Marine, farther up in case Morgan needed help. So the rest of us stayed put for about, it was about less than 5 minutes, I think. And, Joe sidled up to me, easing down on one knee, grunting as the water can was shifting on his back. And he's like, what do you think? And I'm like, trying not to think, man. But it'd be better to find something fast and stay out here for days, I said to him quietly. And, he's like, at least the storms, tore this place up, and I looked at him all puzzled. I'm like, dude. And he said, this crap is triple canopy, or worse, being in, triple canopy jungle. We wouldn't be able to see crap if it wasn't sort of wrecked, And I looked around, and he's right, because we've been to places through the Pacific and even in the PI where it was like walking in dusk at sundown, except it's 10 in the morning type of thing. So anyway, small victories, you take them when you can, right? So Pete signaled back, all was clear, and the unit moved up as quickly as we could to the top. And I don't really know how to describe the way I was feeling when I saw that, dark, ebony-like tower rising towards the sky. It was broken partially at the top and covered with vines. And around it was like a dead zone of weeds and rank, river grass. It was around 30 yards, not in a perfect circle, but in a regular clearing. The ancient trees that surrounded the tower all over the escarpment, towered over it, which meant it had been there a long time. No one builds a watchtower without clearing the vantage point, right? So, that was I'm not an archaeologist. I have no idea how old it was. It just looked ancient as hell. So, but looking at the damn thing was giving me tingles up my spine. I think dread is the word we're looking for here. Not fear exactly, just dread of something wrong and primeval, like a racial memory right in the core of your being type of thing. And we knew what to do though, and we got to it. We dumped our gear in an orderly fashion, started on our task. Morgan's team set up a perimeter, while our radio guy he started setting up comms with his PRC 47 or Prick 47 and laying out the PRC 77. Again, Prick 77 is what we refer to. Higgs was started to lay out line already for setting up claymores, and Bustamante was helping him. Doc Weinberg, he was sitting there trying to catch his breath. Like, poor dude was not in field shape yet. 2 years on a sub had made him kind of soft, maybe a little overweight, if you know what I mean. So the LT, he took my team to inspect the tower. It was imposing to be sure, and it wasn't quite round. It was more like an oval. Maybe that was some special architecture. I have no idea. But I mentioned it was an ebony color. But here's the weird thing: it was like black onyx, but with a hint of green embedded in it. It's like, how the hell can you make a tower out of onyx? It seemed new and ancient at the same time. It was weird. So we went around it, eyes peeled, scanning up and down every which way. It was hard to know how to do this. We weren't looking for men. We're looking for a monster. It didn't have rifles or firearms, etc. But that'd be a trip. A flying monster with an M60 machine gun. That's not something you want to run into. But here's the deal: there was no door. I repeat, no door. Who the hell builds a tower with no door? Well, how about flying creatures? Yeah, exactly. So there were markings at different intervals that were pretty elaborate and looked a little bit like hieroglyphics, but not. They were faint and barely visible, but you could make out certain animal-like images and people etched into the stone or onyx or whatever it was made from. And I'm running my hand along one of the sections, looking at the different markings and images when I saw it. I ripped away some of the vines, and I took a swig of water from my canteen, and I spit it at the wall and rubbed at it with my bandana. And this section of that, let's call it a panel, there was 3 winged beings standing, and they held weapons, like sort of a sword-like, but not exactly. In front of them were, kneeling like 10 or so figures that were clearly men. I mean, they had no wings at least, but the 3 standing figures did. And it was hard to make out the details, but the faces of the wing things appeared to be human-like and not quote-unquote monster-like. So that was odd. I called the lieutenant over to show him, and he ripped a page from his notebook and used his field pencil to try and make a rubbing of it so we could see it more clearly. And it half worked, but you could see the faces were human-like, but it reminded me of pictures I'd seen of like Inca or Mayan art and the way they drew people, but these people had wings instead of the stylized look that like I'm talking about in South America and Central America. So the LT decided it's time to see if we could see the city from where the fishermen had, seen it, and supposedly it was close. So he pulled Morgan's team in tighter around our makeshift camp and left Higgs and the radio operator with Morgan's team to guard the camp. Doc and Bustamante joined us, and the 7 of us fanned out and started in the direction we thought we needed to go. Bustamante was actually carrying the Prick 77 so we could communicate back to camp. I took the lead, if I remember correctly, with Joe walking slack behind me. But Buddha was on my right flank, and my other, my other guy was on the left, and the lieutenant and the others were had fallen in behind me. So, honestly, I wasn't actually, brimming with confidence on this whole op. The whole op seemed rushed to me, and frankly, I didn't trust the new guys, including the lieutenant yet. Not yet at least. I had a feeling there was going to be regrets after this one. Bad karma indeed. So. I had loaded my grenade launcher with a flechette round. If you don't know what that is, think of a giant shotgun round that will fly much farther than a shotgun's range and just shred a human and hopefully any monster from up close. So I found the opening in the jungle we were looking for without too much trouble. There was some battered, cobblestones or the like embedded in the ground, like there had been a paved area here at one point in history. So, eyes on the ground, eyes ahead, eyes to the trees, and repeat. I was looking everywhere at once. And, we were Marines. And against a human enemy, we were very good at our jobs. But at this moment, it felt like amateur hour, okay? SARU would become a lethal unit with time. But in my bones, somehow, I knew we were going to pay a price for for this OJT mission, which is, means on the job training basically. You know, I would say that our innate reflexes, we're still looking for human ambushers and not for something to pop out and eat us or worse. But I was starting to see a lot of light breaking through the jungle in front of me, and I held my hand up, halting the guys behind me, and I moved another 10 yards or so, slowly and cautiously. The ground was sheared away in front of me into a straight cliff. Okay, so I peered, cautiously over the edge, and some cataclysm of something had broken the escarpment in the past, and it was a mess of rubble at the bottom that was overgrown and choked with weed growth. But the face of the cliff right in front of me was like a straight drop of about 100 feet before the mound of debris sloped, downward to the jungle floor. That's probably the highest point that we were looking over right there. And, I motioned for the team to move up, and I felt Lieutenant Kinsey next to me, but my attention was on what lay in front of us, like less than half a click away. So it was a ghost of a city. Weeds, trees, bamboo grew between the stones of broken piers and shattered pavement that had once been looked to be streets and a giant plaza in a broad courtyard. From every side except the riverside, the jungle had crept in, masking fallen columns and crumbling mounds with dark green and brown plant life. Here and there's decaying towers that reeled against the midday sky, and the broken pillars were jutting up amongst the fallen walls. But in the center was a marble-looking pyramid, not an Egyptian style, but like maybe think in the Americas or something. I think the step pyramid is the term. Holy shit! I heard the lieutenant, say as he was fumbling for his binoculars, and just I heard Bustamante saying, "What the hell is that?" That was a lumbering figure that was like shambling around in the shadows and disappeared behind the pyramid before we could even react. Okay, so I heard Doc say, a giant bird maybe hopping around looking for food. It was a giant bat, said Joe. An ape, I think. It was some sort of ape, said my other guy. And I said Kane. And I'm sorry I can't remember his name all the time. He only did this one mission with us. And I heard Buddha say, kind of uneasily for a big guy, a winged ape. And then I hear him say, better we'd offed ourselves before coming here. This place is haunted. And I was about to mock him for his superstition, but I checked myself because I'd seen zombies, and now I'm seeing a winged monster. Who was I to say it wasn't haunted? How the hell do I know? So, we suddenly regained some common sense, pulled back from the edge and undercover, and Lieutenant Pinkey low crawled back to the edge in a more covered spot and proceeded to scan the area with his binos. And I think we waited, silently for about 10 minutes before Kinsey came. Pinkey, sorry, did I just say Kinsey again? Lieutenant Pinkey came scooting back to us. Okay, nothing moving, he said. Let's head back. We need to plan. So at this point, it was around 1,300 hours or so when the LT held a, war council, so to speak. We're kind of clustered with Pete and Bustamante watching the sky, but, where they could hear the lieutenant speaking. And we only had about 5 hours of daylight left, and we needed to get a move on, before dark. So it kind of went like this. The LT reminded us of the mission objectives, which was 1, determine if the creature existed. Check. We'd just done that. Determine how many there were, unknown at this point. Assess and neutralize the creature if possible. We had a lot of discretion on this one and on how to accomplish the neutralizing part, but the last part of our mission was to recon the city ruins and see what we'd find, basically. That's the gather info part. So the radio men told us we had 2 birds on station out of Subic starting at 0700 tomorrow. And they'd have Snake and Nape and Willie Pete, meaning napalm and white phosphorus. That was a comfort. The rest of it, not so much. Especially, essentially, the lieutenant wanted us to bait a trap by being conspicuous in our camp. So we were going to set up a comfortable camp like we'd be here for days, and we had 5 hours to do most of the work. So everyone but Doc and the radio man had done survival training in jungle environment. In fact, most of us had done it in the Philippines. And if you don't know, the jungles in the P are just lush with things to help you survive. Vines that contain water that you can cut and drink from, like it's a pipe. Plenty of wild fruit and small game to be trapped if you need it. And the best part is the bamboo, I think I mentioned earlier, including the giant bamboo species. And then the vines that are like natural rope. You can make platform beds, lean-tos, shelters, easily if you know how. And you can even use that bamboo for makeshift, barriers. So The lieutenant wanted us to make 4 fires in a square and 1 in the middle, and he went over a few more things and asked for input, feedback basically. To me, a lot of this sucked, but I could see several faces feeling the same, but we didn't have a lot of choices, so no one was answering, and I don't think anyone was comfortable with Lieutenant Pinky yet, and they didn't want to rock the boat, or they couldn't think of anything that was better at the time. But the lieutenant asked again, and I said we should probably make a 3-fire triangle with 1 in the middle. And he asked why, so I explained, well, it's the international signal fire technique. If we need to, we kill the fire in the middle, build up the other 3 so they can be seen from the air, and that's in case we needed a way to mark a target or for air support, etc. He thought about it a few seconds and agreed. And we wanted illumination, but this way it would serve a dual purpose just in case. So we set to with purpose behind us, and well before dusk we were ready and set up. Having 3 of us standing watch at a time and alternating, we managed to build some platforms for sleeping, with some cover overhead. We dug a latrine, temporary latrine. It had a wall and a little overhang. But the main thing was we made a small spider pit with a bamboo cover. We could post someone in as an ambusher, or observer, without being seen. And I told you that the bamboo and the vines made life easy. Plus, Higgs had a fold-out Gerber saw that I made a note of. I was going to get one for myself. I had a Gerber stiletto that could shave an ape on a thing that, on a string that would dangle behind my back that was supported on my harness, that was hidden. Okay, so I knew Gerber. It was good stuff. And again, we'd set up 3 large fires in a triangle about 60 feet apart, and a small cooking pit in the middle near the sleeping area. The best touch was the 4 claymores Higgs had set up in a square, using the spaces between the fires, sealing them with brush and bamboo. Not that a monster should be, understanding what a claymore was, but who knew for sure. We'd also, just randomly placed some sharpened stakes around the camp perimeter, just to slow down any ground intruder. So, the reality was we expected something that could potentially fly to bypass everything and just drop in on us from the air and not walk up and say, "Hello, it's me, the monster. I'm here to kill you now," or something. But we even made a hot meal, and I whipped up my world famous cocoa coffee, or semi-famous, I should say, because you've probably never heard of it. But you take instant coffee and cocoa packs and all the creamer you have, and sugar packs from the MRAs you have, and you're going to get that mixed in with water. You need 1 canteen cup, and you set it over a fire to start heating. Okay, this is going to be thick at the moment. That's okay though. And as it starts heating, you crumble 2 chocolate cookies from the MRA meals into it. These cookies were like 2-layer wafer-like things with chocolate in the middle, and just dipped in it basically. Picture a 2-layer Kit Kat but circular. So everyone else fills their canteen cup half full of water, and they heat that up. So when I get the sludge near boiling, I'd spoon some of it off into everyone's cups, and they mix it up. It's now thinner, but it's really rich. Like I said, you take the wins you can get, right? So as dark approached, everyone was trying to get a piss in or whatnot, so as not to have to go in the night if possible. But Lieutenant Pinky, he divided the watch like this. We'd take 3-hour watches. Each fire team would alternate, manning the perimeter, with the fires, within the fires, basically, with 1 Marine in the spider hole, able to use one of the 2 night vision goggles that we had to scan the sky and cut down on the fire glare. So they'd have the Prick 77 radio to be able to quietly talk to the other radio. So Bustamante and Higgs would take turns manning the Claymore rig that Higgs had set up. The LT and the radio men would alternate on the radio, and Doc got to pick whatever watch he wanted at that point. So now we had stacked a ton of dead wood and bamboo to fuel the fires, and with luck it was going to be enough for the entire night. My team took first watch with Lieutenant Pinky and Bustamante, and I took the spider hole. I wanted the night vision. I had a theory, and I wanted to test it basically. Higgs lit the fires before he turned in using bug repellent and some sterno tabs. Everyone carried those, for hot meals, and they were just big enough to cast some good light without being overpowering. And they'd also help with the bugs, even though we'd strung mosquito netting around the sleeping platforms. Critters were still going to get in. So the first 2 watches were basically just uneventful, and my team was back on watch, and I'm in the spider hole when around 0100 I saw it. Okay, You see, I'd figured that the thing wouldn't just rush in at us. After all, there's 13 of us, and it was alone. Well, we hoped it was alone. My thought it would, was that it would scout us. Even hunting animals don't just rush in if they want to eat. They'll stalk. So whether it was a man or a beast, I figured it would do just that. And where would a monster with wings scout us from? Exactly. The weird tower with no door. So just after 0100, I'm leaning back against the earth wall inside the spider hole, and we'd made gaps in the bamboo cover to be able to see through. And I had the night vision goggles, propped up on my head like you push up your sunglasses. The sky was like semi-overcast, but there were some stars visible. And the camp was pretty quiet, but the lack of jungle noise around us was unsettling. Again, just as before, you could hear normal nighttime noises farther away, but just like a dead zone around us. And I could hear Doc snoring again, though. Someone needed to poke his ass with a stick to get him to stop that. But suddenly I thought, or I don't know, maybe it's more accurately that I sensed a shadow blot out a couple of the stars. So I slipped the goggles down, closed my eyes, and I turned them on. Slowly, I opened my eyes, letting them adjust, and looked up at the tower. Sure enough, I was right. I could just make out a figure peering over the edge of the broken parapet, I guess is the word, on top of the tower. I couldn't see the whole body, just like an outline of its head and shoulders and an arm and maybe part of the wings. Now, night vision in the 80s was expensive, and it was trash. You can spend $50 nowadays for something better, but supposedly these things cost like $6,000 back then, and they sucked, but it was enough to see. But honestly, if you fired your weapon while you were looking through them, you'd blind yourself from the muzzle flash. Still, I debated it. Instead, I squelched the radio handset twice. What do you got? I heard the LT ask quietly. Top of the tower, I said back. There was a pause, and he's like, do you have a shot? Risky. And I answered him, truthfully, it was risky. But just then the thing lifted off and flew away behind the tower. So I was like, it's gone anyway. It's like, Roger, stay put, out. So my watch was done in like another 2 hours, but I didn't sleep after that. Morgan had relieved me, and I told him what I'd seen and directions he'd come from, and and where he'd flown off to, but nothing else was happening. So I went around and I just helped stoke the fires for just settling in, leaning up against my pack, near the sleeping platforms, but not turning in. I could see that Lieutenant Penke was staying up too, not turning in. So it was a bit of a nervous night after that for me, but nothing was seen, and dawn finally came, and everyone was up so quickly that I don't think anyone was really sleeping. Adrenaline and nervous energy were already coursing through me, and I assumed everyone else was feeling the same. So Pete was already heating coffee around the cook fire, and I handed him my canteen cup, and he poured me off a bit. I drank it black, like in a couple gulps. It was warm, not boiling. And we had a bit of banter as everyone moved around, grabbing chow, hitting latrine, or working on their gear. The LT told us we need to be ready in 20 minutes, so I just devoured like a chicken a la king MRE without heating it. And I just loaded it with hot sauce, crumbled one of those reconstituted hash browns into it. Okay, and so why do I remember, what I ate, but I can't remember people's names? Well, I remember it struck me as funny since my grandma used to make chicken a la king that was absolutely delicious. And I'm thinking this could be my last meal, but it also reminded me of my grandma. And by the way, it was not nearly as delicious as my grandma's. So I stuffed some Copenhagen, the tobacco dip in my cheek, hoping that, that and the coffee would loosen me up, if you know what I mean. It was not to be. So that's never in the movies, is it? You know how annoying it is to start a mission or patrol, wondering if you're going to have to cop a squad or worse, mess your pants during the op. So anyway, we were ready with time to spare, and so this is kind of how it went down. Lieutenant, Doc, and our two fire teams would take the broken trail down that the LT he'd spied from the top of the cliffside, and we'd try to follow that down to the ruins. We covered our gear within the camp, just stripping out everything we needed. And we weren't wearing helmets and flax in this weather or on this mission, which was great until I remembered, well, hey, my helmet had saved me in Okinawa. Bad karma again. So Bustamante, Higgs, and the radio men would stay on top, undercover at the cliffside. Bustamante would be our eyes looking over us, and Higgs was left as extra security for the radio men in case things went wrong and we needed air support or the PT boat. So Joe drew the duty to carry the Prick 77 so we could talk to, let's call them the HQ team on the cliff. So locked and loaded, we moved out and made for the trail that would take us down. So my team's in the lead, I had Buddha on point with me walking slack. My other guy and Joe were behind me with Lieutenant Pinky and Doc, followed by Morgan's team. Okay, and the trail wasn't too bad, but it made me wonder what the hell was keeping it beaten down enough to navigate, because the flying thing was not going to do it. But I didn't see any animal prints or prints of any kind. It was just jungle grass and weeds. Um, and it really didn't take us that long to get down to the ruined city. Like I said, from the viewpoint, it appeared to be half a click or less. Um, the sun was, I remember the sun was coming up slowly, lazily even above the jungle. And it was kind of flooding the ruins with this dull light that left shadows just, lurking beneath the tottering walls. And I pointed out a slim round tower that had reeled on its rotting base, and a broad expanse of overgrown slabs led up to it, flanked by these, fallen columns, I guess is the word. There was a massive altar in front of the tower, and there were channels or gutters running alongside it. And it reminded me of images of like sacrificial altars back in the Americas. And I just remember like a little shudder going through me. But anyway, we had to move on, so I picked out a small building and we moved towards it. That was, it was more intact than a lot of the others. And it was odd because we could see this like mural, like painting or drawing, glinting from within a recessed wall that had an overhang. I don't even know how to, I don't know, think of like the Flintstones or something where there's an overhang, but, not the Flintstones, but like a stone building. Anyway, I know it. It reminded me of going to the zoo, and you have all those outdoor learning buildings that you visit to learn about a specific animal and such. So it was something like that. Like, I don't think it was really occupied for living, just for something else. Anyway, the mural, it was giving me the creeps. A lot of it was ruined, and there was a part that showed, and I mean clearly showed winged beings, just, I don't know, let's call it ruling over non-winged beings, as in humans. The ones with wings, though, they weren't monsters. I don't know how to describe them. Maybe, I don't know, regal is the word I'm looking for. The thing we saw like shambling around yesterday was not regal looking at all. Maybe it was some degenerate inbred remnant of these clearly, ancient beings. But you know what it reminded me of? Bible stories about the Watchers, winged beings, angels, who the hell knows? I don't know, something like that. So I heard the lieutenant curse and say we should have a camera on this mission, and I'm like, yeah. I had a small waterproof, camera back in Hawaii that I was wishing I had brought, because you know what a pic of that place would be worth if I could prove this place existed today. It'd be amazingly expensive, I think. So I heard the LT check in with the group on the cliff as we continued slowly poking around, and there's no sign of the creature. Maybe it's out hunting, or maybe it was watching us from some high place we couldn't see. So we were debating on setting up an ambush when, bad karma showed up to bite us in the ass, or in this case, the shoulder. My 14 member, Kane, like I said, was poking around at a mound of rubble from one of the toppled walls when a cobra just reared up out of nowhere and spit right in his eyes and followed up with a strike to his shoulder. The thing disappeared down a hidey hole before anyone could even react. So our guy's down screaming, clawing his eyes, with Doc trying to check his shoulder and yelling for help. Right? And Lieutenant's on the radio with our HQ guys on this cliff, while also yelling at the Doc, asking if our guy is bitten. And Doc can't really get a look at him because the guy's screaming and thrashing so much, and Doc doesn't want to hit him with morphine, so if he is bit, it'll most likely kill him. Then again, if he is bitten, he's dead anyway, so we're too far from help and anti-venom. You can't apply anti-venom in the field. I mean, it needs to be controlled. So Buddha and I drop in to help Doc by holding the guy down. Doc is pouring like water in his eyes, trying to clear out some of the spit, and with our help, he like rips the guy's shirt open and stretches the undershirt down. No bite. So the snake must have hit his harness and it didn't go through. Still, he's in danger of going blind if we can't wash that spit out sufficiently, So, but Doc hits him with morphine since there's no bite, and the guy starts calming, pretty quickly. So Lieutenant's on the radio with Bustamante when there's a curse from someone through it, and it's cut off with this scream, right? And a shot echoes out from the escarpment. And we had to leave Doc and our guy, but we had to leave Buddha too to offer some protection. So this was like just all going wrong in a heartbeat. 7 of us, we run off in this like controlled jog with Joe trying to raise the cliff team on the radio, but he's not having any luck. No one's answering, and we ran less than like 2 minutes before we could see what appeared to be 2 bodies at the base of the cliff. Worse, there's a body dangling awkwardly from the cliff by his harness. Alive or dead, we didn't know at that point, but Bustamante and the radio man were clearly dead. And so we're down 4 men just like that and accomplished nothing. The green suck was really about to swallow us all, and there was flip all we could do about it. I could feel anger boiling inside me, but it was quickly just replaced by horror. It's a trick. Higgs is a bait, Lieutenant, and I yelled because it was Higgs up on this, hanging from his harness, and everyone was scanning the sky and, squinting at the broken jungle as if expecting anything to jump out. And I'm like, no, 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 it's going after Doc and the others, I tried to explain. So we had a major dilemma at hand. We needed to check on Higgs, but if I was right, then Doc and the others were in grave danger. So Lieutenant makes a quick decision, and we rolled the dice, basically. He sends Morgan and Pete to get Higgs. The rest of us took off back towards Doc. So the gamble was that I was right and that Morgan and Pete are going to be fine and the creature would be after Doc and the others, right? So, and if the other radio was still up top and working, Morgan would be able to call us. But we heard Buddha's saw open up in 3 staccato bursts, and praying I didn't catch a stray in the face, I pushed my legs as hard as I could. I wasn't the fastest runner, but I could run forever, even in full harness back then. And I was the first to spot our guides as I burst back into the open space near that mural building. And the team had dragged our down guy, over there to be able to put their backs against the wall. And that overhang was giving them some cover. So, relief started to rush over me, but it was instantly turning to fear just as I sensed movement out of the corner of my left eye. So I dropped like a sack of rocks and pivoted as a dark, hairy arm swept through the space where my head had just been a second before. Rising on one knee, I barely had time to settle my weapon. I jerked the grenade launcher trigger, and that flechette round just thundered out of the barrel like a giant hornet, shearing off part of that thing's wings, but barely penetrating the monster's shoulder. I could see pieces of metal sticking out of the thing's fur or skin or whatever the hell it was. So my eyes were taking in what my brain couldn't quite process yet. The thing was man-like, but its legs seemed like stunted and bowed. It had this, a malformed head with like a broad face and a misshapen black-nailed paws or hands on huge hairy arms. It was wasn't a man, it wasn't a devil, it wasn't a beast, but some cruel, twisted trick of devolution, basically, that was also superhuman. So, like I said, maybe it's just some inbred remnant of a regal race at some point. But I knew I was a dead man if those arms got a hold of me. So luckily, I wasn't alone, because rounds started hitting that monster from all sides. And it wasn't bulletproof, but it was taking damage like something that, that nothing normal is going to take. So then that thing's, baleful red eyes were looking right at me as I was fumbling for a WP round for my launcher. And I was backpedaling, trying to put some distance between us as the thing let out a scream of rage, basically, and tried to take off. But guess what? It couldn't. My shot had actually damaged the wing too much. And everyone else is advancing on it and firing, but the monster feinted at ring and turned back to me and charged. And I was ready, though, because I knew it wanted me. The first source of its torment, yeah, it's coming for me. Like any wounded beast, it wanted to take its tormentor with it, right? So as the WP round thumped out, I already knew it was a direct hit before it landed. And that white phosphorus exploded, just enveloping that creature in fire and agony that doesn't end. And it screamed. And this time, it's pure agony, the scream, not rage. It was so loud with even all the gunfire, it made my ears throb. So the thing starts, it falls to its knees, and it's on all fours, begins crawling towards me as more rounds are hitting it. And the other Marine that Pete had given the 203 to also hit it with a WP round. And it fell flat and rolled on its back, and it shuddered a couple times, and it died. It's still burning, though, as the lieutenant walks up and jams his weapon in the thing's mouth and just unloaded a whole magazine right into its brain. So at this point, we kind of figured the thing was definitely alone and flying solo, to make a bad pun. But if there had been others, maybe there were somewhere in the island, but if they were close, as far as we're concerned, if they weren't here, it was over. Mission accomplished, and time to swoop the hell out of there. So there was some good news. I mean, Higgs was alive. Pete came down to let us know because the Prick 47 was smashed and useless. Higgs was, he was groggy and he had a headache, but he's alive and he could walk. So we had 2 dead bodies and a wounded body we need to carry. So despite the good news about Higgs, we still had some issues to deal with. We needed to get our casualties downriver, ASAP, and we needed to decide if we needed to explore more. Now, Lieutenant Penke risked his career here, I think, by deciding we were done and screw the consequences. That's some brass balls right there. So we left any useless gear. We built up the 3 fires and the bonfires, and we threw as much green live branches on as was feasible without killing the fire to create white smoke, and we got our dead and wounded onto the boats as quickly as we could. Um, we made contact with the PT boat pretty easily as we got further down the river, which was fortunate because we deserved some freaking luck at this point. And before we knew it, we were safe back on the patrol boat and on our way back to Subic. And they called in air, but it was more than 2 jets, and they bombed that area into oblivion. And it's really kind of a shame because I think we lost part of human history there. And I'm not sure people will believe it anyway. But the whole thing had been just a total bummer. Did we win? I don't think so. Sure, we killed a monster, but we buried history, and the mission cost us 2 dead, severely wounded who would not return, and then indirectly another death. So the other guy in the great grenade launcher, yeah, the reason I can't remember him is awful. When we got back to Hawaii, he found his wife had been cheating on him and had filed for divorce while he was gone. So a couple days later, the guy bent over a loaded M16 and blew his heart onto the ceiling. Nice, huh? Yeah. So, but in the moment though, as I drifted off to sleep in the PD boat, my stomach was full. I was all cleaned up, and well, I thought this was it. SARU is done. We screwed up, and they're going to pull the plug on it, or pull it on us specifically. I was wrong though. The powers that be, they thought we did fine. We'd find ourselves in Tasmania within the month looking for new horrors, but that's a supernatural tale for another time. The Philippines.